So I always wonder where to start on a day like today when all I really want to do is look out at you and say, there you are. And I say this not because y'all have been lost, but that I've finally found you, and my heart therefore is glad. I meant what I said last week about needing the words in front of me of needing their guide, of needing their surety in the face of the waves of emotion that were before me. Well, this week isn't much different. And I've come to trust my tears. I trust them because they do not fall readily, and they never have. And it occurs to me that if truth is present in an admonition, well, that's a good as place to start as any, isn't it? So with tears and trust, we'll begin our walk in faith together. The first time that I saw a man cry was when my father did at the funeral for his grandpa. Great Pop, we used to call him, that old salt. I don't remember much about that day except that I couldn't take my eye off the single tear streak that ran down my father's cheek. My grandpa, Pop, well, his brother gave the eulogy that day. It was the first time that I ever heard someone talk about what happens to us after we die. I can still see him in the pulpit. I can still see what he was wearing. And he said that day, that his father would lay in Jesus' arms. I sat there and tried to imagine in my mind what that would look like, my great Pop in his dress blues and all. It's because I sat in between the towers of my family, all sailors and airmen. I sat waiting for the bosun to whistle Edgar Phares aboard and St. Peter to give him permission to cross the quarterdeck, which in my mind must be just right inside the pearly gates. To a bunch of salts, then, there is no familiar story, no more greater story in the Bible than that of Jonah. A grand sea yarn it is, too. One of mystery, enchantment, and yes, warning. But it is also a story of great compassion, too. A story of conversion. And you know that. For I understand folks around here that know that there is a long way round to Nineveh. And the verity that all of us have our own Ninevehs to encounter. But sometimes that truth takes a while for it to sink in. For our Ninevehs are real, and we know it. It's true especially when we see conflict ahead and run from it, just like Jonah did, finding the quickest ticket out of here, whether the destination be Tarshish or Tulsa. The presence of conflict in our lives is a given and for the most part, we spend a significant portion of our lives figuring out what to do about each of them. Some of us seek signs. Some of us seek counsel. And some of us let conflicts rage because whales seem to be in short supply out here. Whether the conflicts of our lives are constant or infrequent, raging fires or slow burns, they exist, and through all of it, the condition of our hearts matter. Whether our days be tempest-tossed or placid. Jesus knew this, and Jonah got around to knowing it too after a boat ride, a fishing trip, and an unfortunate incident with a gourd. But even though we know that story, we know the whole story like Father Mark wanted us to. I know that sometimes it's hard to remember all of it. When, like Jonah, I know the call is to Nineveh, and I'm on my way to Joppa. And it's there that I've come to realize something recently, and that is that though there may be a long way around to Nineveh, we spend most of our days living on that road that Jonah walked between his home and his home port. Or you might say between Hog Shooter Creek and 9th, between Colonial Estates and Bartlesville High, between what I'm telling myself and where God is calling me. On that well-worn road between what I'm telling myself and what God is trying to communicate to me, between home and Joppa, I realized that I needed to stop and read the road signs. Speaking of signs, we shouldn't miss that we got a big fat one right in front of us today. Jesus told us about this one. You remember? The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, asking him for a sign from heaven. Mind you, he just fed 4,000 people, healed a man with a speech impediment, fed 5,000 more people, raised Jairus' daughter, ministered to a demoniac, gave us the parable of the sower, healed a paralytic, called his disciples, was tempted by Satan, all after having a dove land on him after he came out of the River Jordan. That's when the Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign from heaven. I'm glad you see that. The scriptures said that they did this to test him. And I know by your laugh that you know that all they did was test his patience. Which is why I love when the scripture says that Jesus sighs. I don't have time for it. And he says to them, the only sign that will be given this generation is the sign of Jonah. So you see, it all ends up back here. In every conflict, there are signs, whether we miss them, read them, misinterpret them, follow them, disobey them, keep them, fight them, or try to escape from them. They are there. And just like that, whether we know it or not, we are on our way to Joppa. So here are some road signs to watch for. Mind you, this isn't a definitive list. Each sign is kind of like a question we should ask ourselves on the way to Joppa. Whose interests are at stake? Whom do they serve? Do these interests serve to build up or to tear down? Are they in service to my neighbor? Are they in service to the Lord? What alternatives are present? Am I safe? Are they safe? Who can help me? How can creativity assist me in addressing this conflict? Am I really listening? How do all of these answers align with my identity as a disciple of Christ? My friends, do not be troubled, okay? We will always miss some of these signs. Nevertheless, and I want you to remember this, there is one underlying current that follows us on the road to Joppa, and even on the long way round to Nineveh. And that is that the water that bears us up, the same water that sometimes rises to our necks, that is shed from our eyes, the same water that the whale swims in, and the water that awaits us on the shores of decision, is all living water if we choose to follow Jesus. And it is in this living water that grace is to be found, to be encountered, to be received, and then given away. That's what we learn when we follow Jesus. We're always on a road somewhere. So when we find ourselves on the way to Joppa, the port where decisions are made, perhaps it would serve us well to remember that if there is a long way around to Nineveh, well, there's a shortcut here in Bartlesville. Jesus gave us the road signs to follow, and maybe all we need to remember is that on this highway of grace, U-turns are allowed.